So my name is Stephanie Wheler. I graduated in 2018 with Manchester's Masters in Pharmacogenomics. That does mean I was in the second graduating class for this program. I also did receive my undergrad from Manchester the year before in 2017 with a degree in biology chemistry.
Great. And can you tell us what pharmacogenomics is? I'm sure you get that a lot, and maybe you're tired of answering it, but I'm sure anyone who bumps into you says, that sounds interesting, but what exactly is that?
Yeah, so PGX briefly is the study of how a person's genetics affects their response to medications. And this is the idea that DNA provides the code or the blueprint for different proteins, which then in turn are either the targets for drugs or target the drugs themselves. So they either break down those drugs or move those drugs around the body. So the idea is that if there's a change or a mutation in your DNA, then that changes those proteins, and that changes how someone may respond to different medications.
Wonderful. And you made it sound super interesting right off the bat, but besides that, what made you interested in pharmacogenomics? With it being such a new kind of emerging field, when did you hear about it, and what got you interested in wanting to pursue a graduate degree?
Right. So I was always interested in genetics, just in general. I knew when I graduated high school and went to college that I wanted to do something that would eventually end up in a genetic-based, like, scientific field, but I really didn't know specifics at that point. So I thought, well, Manchester has a really good science program, so I declared the biology chemistry major just as like a general foundation, like a solid science foundation. And then actually I was a junior, I think, and I attended a job fair in Fort Wayne, and I found Manchester's pharmacy school table at the job fair, and I talked to them, and I was pretty sure I didn't want to go the PharmD route. You know, I wasn't interested in working directly with patients. But while I was talking to the folks at the table, they actually mentioned that within the next couple of years, Manchester was hoping to launch a new master's program in what they call pharmacogenomics. I'd never heard of it before then. So one of those people actually gave me Dr. Dave Kaiser's contact information, and he was going to head the program. And I actually ended up meeting with him one-on-one 2 or 3 times, I think, before I graduated undergrad, and he just kept me in the loop on the development of the program and, you know, how it was going. And just based on timeline, the first class of the program was the year that I was a senior in undergrad. So he kind of like let me know how it went, and then that means I would be in the second class, and the rest is history.
Yeah, Dr. Kaiser could get anyone excited about pharmacogenomics. So I'm sure that didn't take long in talking with him to get thinking that this is what you're going to pursue. So can you tell us a little bit about, since graduation, what you've done, your work in the field, and kind of where you're at now, what your position is, and how you got there?
Yeah, so in this, I think it would have been the spring semester of the program, we had a class where we, like, every week we looked at different existing pharmacogenomics companies and, you know, like, what kind of services do they offer? How do they navigate that space? You know, like, how are they making decisions as far as which mutations to look at and things like that? And the owner of one of those companies, her name's Dr. Anna Lingerfeld, and the company is called Genemarkers. She gave 1 or 2 lectures to our class just about how their company works. So that's how I met Anna, and I just reached out to her and asked her if they happened to have any positions available. And I ended up joining Genemarkers as a lab tech, you know, right after graduation in 2018. So I was a lab technician there until March of 2020, when I became the lab supervisor. And that's currently what I do now. I am the lab supervisor at Genemarkers. It's a little lab in Kalamazoo, Michigan. We do some like genomics-based research and also some clinical diagnostic testing. One of those tests being PGX. The other test right now is COVID. We've had a very exciting couple of years, quite busy with the COVID testing, but now we're also, as COVID settles down a little, we're starting to see the PGX testing ramp back up. So that's exciting too.
Yeah, COVID changed everyone a little bit, right? So we've all had to kind of adapt and meet the needs of it. But that's really interesting to hear that you guys have that flexibility to do that and to again meet the needs of what we have and what we're facing with, and really meet that demand. Can you talk a little bit more about your current position and what does a typical day look like, and what are your main responsibilities and what you like most about where you're currently at?
Yeah. So day to day, my days can look very different. But in general, it's a mix of actual lab bench work, reviewing the lab bench work that other technicians have done, and writing or updating our protocols. And then we also still do a lot of research. So just a lot of good old, PubMed literature searches, still do that a lot. And then as far as PGX specifically goes, our current typical PGX workflow, we run PGX on something called an open array. It's a customizable microarray panel, which lets us put up to 60 different mutations that we want to look at on one panel design. And then we can run 20-ish clinical samples at once. So you can look at all 60 of those mutations for 20 different people at the same time, which is really cool. We typically run one of those arrays per week right now. So we sort of batch or collect samples throughout the week as they come in, and then run the array typically on Thursdays. So what that kind of breaks down to, we receive those, it's a buccal cheek swab sample. So we'll receive those throughout the week. We isolate the DNA from those cheek swabs. We then process that DNA on the open array platform. We also do something called copy number variation for one of the genes that we look at. That's also run on a PCR platform. And then we use the software to look at those genotyping calls. And if everything looks good, everything makes sense, and we have some control samples that we run to make sure that those look good. And then we upload that data to our system, which generates a report that actually uses an algorithm that takes the genotyping information and turns that into dose guidance for different drugs.
So you mentioned having to look for literature, going on PubMed and consistently updating yourself. It seems like this is an evolving field, and it seems like you have to be on your toes all the time. Do you have any examples of literature you found that made you make certain changes, or how do you use that? How do you bring in new literature and adapt to it right on the spot and kind of use it in your workflow immediately?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually just in June, I think, launched a new version of our panel. So it ends up being every couple of years or so, we sort of gather enough of that new information to warrant redesigning the panel. And it's also sort of involved with if the FDA says anything about if there's any regulations that change on testing, or if bodies like CPIC come out with new guidelines for specific mutations. So on this new panel that we just released, there were actually, I would say, maybe 5 or 6 new mutations for a couple of those very pertinent CYP450 enzymes. So CYP2D6 got several new mutations that CPIC and the FDA consider what they call tier 1. So they have more evidence and higher degree of relevance for clinical implementation. So we had to make sure that we had those mutations on our panel, and a couple of them we didn't. So that was a reason to update that panel. So yeah, a lot of it is checking the CPIC guidelines and seeing, if the FDA has changed anything. But then, yeah, just that sort of gathering that body of information and studies that have been done, and making sure that everything that is recommended or required for calling those genes is on our panel.
Great. And kind of sticking with this new information and figuring all this out on the fly. I mean, have you or your company done any research or had any publications with anything as you're collecting this data and really on the frontier of pharmacogenomics?
Yeah, so there's 2 main studies that I'll talk about. One of them is Genemarkers has been involved in a lot of opioid research. It's opioid use and opioid misuse. So this actually started before I joined Genemarkers. Right when I started in June of 2018, they were on the tail end of the pilot which was like 400 patients in Southwest Michigan. They had collected buccal swabs and then run their DNA through a couple more of those custom open array panels that, Genemarkers as a company had designed through research. They had picked out different mutations and different genes that are involved in opioid response, or things like reward pathways in the brain, different things like that. And they just wanted to see what would happen. And like I said, I came in on the tail end of that. So I helped with like data aggregation and QC and things like that. And turns out that I think it was 19 different mutations were clinically or statistically significant, as far as either between different genders and opioid use, or the risk of relapse. So that was pretty exciting just from that small of a pilot study. So that study has since been published, and we're continuing with like follow-up studies now. So we've done one study with the state of Ohio, and they collected like 1,300 some patients in a little over a year. And we ran all the genotyping on that, and they're currently looking at that data. And we're hoping in this next like funding cycle from the state of Michigan that we will do like a phase 3 back in the state of Michigan. So that's the opioid study. And we're really excited about that because, just from the pilot, we got really cool results. And then during COVID, as I said, we did a lot of COVID testing over the last couple of years. At our busiest, we were processing over 3,000 samples a day for COVID. And we're like, well, that's an awful lot of data coming in that, we could hopefully do something with. So we partnered with the community pharmacies around town that we were already getting COVID samples from. And we set up a community-based research project where people who were already getting COVID tests consented to also give their buccal swab DNA samples. And we designed another panel that looked at mutations and genes that are involved in COVID response. We then looked at the genetics there to see if maybe there was correlation between your likelihood to get sick or test positive, or maybe you live with someone who tested positive and you never did. So were there any like protective effects? And that data we're still looking through, and that's still pending publication. And we actually worked with Dr. Beam on that study.
Both those studies are so fascinating and exciting because as a clinician, I have these questions, but I can't do anything about it, right? I can sit back and, how come this person got COVID and got really sick and this person didn't? Or how come this person is responding to this treatment that we have for opiate use disorder and this one isn't? But I just don't have the tools to do that. So the fact that you're able to really almost in real time ask and answer questions simultaneously and get those answers and those results is really just so fascinating to hear. Do you like that research end of your position? Is that something that has interested you?
Yes, absolutely. I think part of why I went the route I went was I liked the idea of still like being on the bench and doing some research and being able to, like you said, do things almost live time, like, oh, we can go do the research, we can put that panel together, and then as long as we have the access or the resources to, connect ourselves with patients and clinicians, then we can do just about anything, and it's really, really cool.
Switching gears a little bit, thinking back at your time in the master's program, what was your favorite class or your favorite experience through that entire program?
It's a really hard question. I liked every class that we took. I think obviously I was a bit biased towards the lab classes. I like being in the lab, working with my hands, doing the actual science. But I also really liked the pharmacology classes. Knowing that I wasn't going to like get a full PharmD, I really appreciated like just a nice foundation on what are different drug classes and how do they work, and being able to tie that side of it into the genetics that we obviously got a lot more education on. But just so like now when new drug gene like guidelines come out, when I see a drug name, I have a rough idea, what it does and what it's used for, and that's really helpful.
Yeah, it seems like some parallels between the two programs, PharmD and the master's program, is I think we do a good job on both ends of preparing you to read new literature and to educate yourself, right? I mean, I think that's an exciting part of this, where there's no way within 3 semesters within a full calendar year, you're going to have everything for the future for a science that's continuing to develop and to emerge. And it's the same way in pharmacy, where there's always going to be new medications and new problems. And you need to be able to find that information and evaluate it yourself. And it sounds like that's something that you do almost every day. And that's something that our PharmD students do every day. And I think that's just such an important tool that we need to have our students have. And it sounds like we're doing a good job in both the programs of that.
Yep. No, I tell people all the time that I think it was, I can't remember now if it was our genetics class or it was something else in that first semester, but we just learned how to read papers. We spent time like, how do you go through a methodology section and ask yourself, like, did they even run the right tests? And did they get the data that they said they were going to get? And game changer. It makes reading these now so much easier. And yeah, definitely appreciate that.
I know you said that you weren't as interested in interacting with patients. You were interested more in the lab side and that research side. We do have a dual degree, PharmD and Pharmacogenomics. For those that are interested in that, what do you think that offers? How do you see pharmacogenomics and more of a practitioner kind of merging those two fields together? How do you see the benefits playing out there?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I would say to someone who is interested in that dual degree is, maybe you're someone who does want to work with patients and you like, that clinician side, but you also are still interested in the research and you want that opportunity to know more about like that bench side. And something that like we, as being in the industry are hopeful for is more pharmacists who have that pharmacogenomics or genetics background, just that like greater understanding of how this works. And a lot of the work that we do right now is what we call like liaison work, where we, if we're talking to a new doctor or a new pharmacist that we haven't worked with previously, it's education. We are, showing them that, PGX is helpful and it's, it improves patient safety and patient drug adherence and things like that. So just the more pharmacists that are in practice that have that background already is just going to be like completely revolutionize like what we have to do.
Yeah, I think the best solution would be if we could just replicate you and put you everywhere. That would probably be the easiest thing, but so far we don't have that technology, right? So we do need pharmacists and other healthcare providers to be able to understand this information as you're developing it and as you're disseminating it, being able to be on the receiving end and using it for our patients.
Right.
I guess the last question would be, what do you think your future looks like? Do you have any specific plans in your career? Specific goals? I know, again, this is a field that's emerging and constantly evolving, so that might be difficult to predict, but what do you think it looks like for you in pharmacogenomics a few years out?
Yeah, no, like you said, great question. I like the idea that it is constantly evolving and we don't know exactly what's coming around the corner. I like that controlled chaos, if you will, and like navigating through that. I definitely like, the idea of PGX becoming obviously more mainstream in healthcare. So, we're focusing on, like I said, those educational tools and, really grow all of us, like as a company and, any other graduates of this program, but like really growing into that liaison type role, like, either community outreach or clinician outreach. We're really focusing on that. Like we put together PowerPoint presentations that we share and, like all that kind of stuff. And, obviously, as that grows and is more successful than just the idea of running tests more often. So like I said earlier, we're running tests weekly right now. So I would love to see that eventually the volume increase enough to where we're running tests every day and like training more and more techs on how to run it and things like that too. We're also hoping in the next couple of years to expand our physical lab space, either moving to a new location, things like that. So obviously that's an exciting thing to look forward to in the next couple of years. And if we get like a newer, bigger space, that's always exciting as far as like being able to bring on new different kinds of tests or services, and I'm excited to see where that goes.
Well, thanks so much, Stephanie. You're obviously a leader in this field already, and a trailblazer as being one of the first few that completed this degree, and they're doing amazing things. So thank you for living out Manchester's vision and mission, and reconnecting with us and updating us on everything that you're doing.
Well, thank you. I also really appreciate it. Like I said, I did my undergrad at Manchester and the master's program. I had a really good time for the 5 years that I was there. I always had, really supportive professors, and the program has obviously worked out very well for me, and I appreciate it. I am having a great time.